Hello and welcome to the 2020 Joyce Youings Memorial Lecture, being given by me, Jonathan Barry of the University of Exeter, on the subject of Bristol and Exeter compared, researching early modern cities. It's an enormous honour to be given the chance to give this lecture in honour of Joyce Youings. Since this lecture series began in 2012, it's been given by a very distinguished set of speakers, including no less than two Regius Professors of History at Oxford and a Cambridge Professor of Modern History, as well as other distinguished Tudor and Southwestern historians. So I'm extremely privileged to be given the chance to do this. This, of course, will be the first lecture of this kind given online, and it's also going to be rather different in another respect, in that whereas most of my predecessors chose a substantive topic to talk about, my talk will be more methodological and in many ways biographical. I am going to be talking about comparison as a method in local and regional history, but I'm also going to be adopting a comparison between Joyce's career and my own. And that is partly because, in addition to being the memorial lecture for Joyce, this is also, in effect, my own valedictory lecture, since I shall be retiring from Exeter this Christmas. And as I, in fact, never gave an inaugural lecture when I was made a professor, this is, in effect, my first and last public lecture as a professor at Exeter. There are interesting parallels in many ways between Joyce's career and my own. She came to Exeter at the age of 29 in 1951 and retired in 1987 after just over 35 years of distinguished service to the university. I came to Exeter at age 29 in 1985, and I shall retire at the age of 20 in 2020. After a similar period of service. And so between the two of us, with the slight overlap, we've effectively covered almost 2/3 of the history of the history department at the University of Exeter. I'm going to deploy my own memories, but also to some extent Joyce's memories. So I remember her telling me about the experience of being the first woman appointed as a historian at Exeter, just as she was to become not only the first female professor of history at Exeter, but perhaps even more extraordinarily, when she was appointed in 1973, the first woman professor that the University of Exeter had ever had. When Joyce joined the history department, it was down in Gandy Street in the city centre, did not move up to the Queen's Building until a decade or so later. And of course, at that point, Exeter was still a university college awarding University of London degrees and didn't become a degree awarding university of its own until a few years after she joined it. And Joyce herself, of course, although she was a Devonian born and bred, had actually been to the University of London for both her undergraduate and for her PhD degree. Another difference we can note is that Joyce, part of the move up to the campus here and the growth of the university, particularly in the 1960s and early 1970s, was the establishment in Exeter not only of the History and Archaeology department, but of a separate economic history department. The department then gradually grew, as I say, until the early 70s, when it then went into a period essentially like most of university life at that period, a period of 10 years essentially with no growth, such that I was in fact the first ordinary level historian that had been appointed at Exeter for 10 years when I joined in 1985. And at that point, believe it or not, Joyce was still the only woman historian at the University of Exeter. I joined a department of history and archaeology, which had about 12 historians in it, and when we had an annual intake of students, single and combined, of about 60. I came to replace Ivan Roots, in fact, not Joyce Youings. Ivan retired just before Joyce. But in effect, I replaced both of them, and I was, until the mid-1990s, the only early modern British historian between Nicholas Orme for the late medieval period and Mike Duffy for the 18th century, although I had two distinguished early modern European colleagues in Colin Jones and Marlin Newitt. And there was indeed a cadre of early modern historians, but they were in the economic history department, people who had been recruited by Walter Minchington and worked across various periods, but including the early modern period. But the enormous growth in Exeter's strength in the early modern really has come since the mid-1990s as part of the enormous growth of the department in both staffing and, of course, particularly in student numbers. It's also reflected the merger of the two departments of history and economic history in 1998 and the growth through that merger of our particular strength in the economic and social history of the early modern. And as Joyce chose as her professorial title, Professor of English Social History, I think she would be deeply pleased at the strength of English social history as carried out at the University of Exeter. Now, when Joyce was appointed, she was appointed very much to develop local history and to be the linking point between the university and its region, a role that she performed notably over the next 3 or 4 decades, leading in particular most of Devon's institutional groups associated with history and heritage, but also more broadly those in the Southwest. And led in many ways by her, by the 1980s, the University of Exeter had developed a very strong leadership role in local and regional history. And although I was not, in fact, appointed with any particular local history brief, because of my own research on Bristol, I developed that role and broadened my interests, as it were, across the Southwest. Although whilst Joyce had focused more on the Tudor period, my focus has been more in the 17th and the 18th centuries. And I think we can say that the first decade when I was here, not because of me, but more generally, between about 1985 and 1995, saw a high point in the role played by the university in local and regional history, though by no means just by the historians. For example, I was very active in our Centre for Southwestern Historical Studies, which was actually jointly set up by a geographer, Roger Kane, and an archaeologist, Bob Hyam, who I joined in leading that initiative. A whole series of important publications emerged in that period from a great deal of activity on local and regional history, coordinated by the Centre and by the University. The New Maritime History of Devon, in which Joyce was a crucial part. A whole series of volumes of Exeter Studies in History, reflecting our work across there, and finally culminating, although not published until the year 2000, in the production of the Historical Atlas of Southwest England. And then I have to say, we then see a break which reflects what happened to universities in the late 1990s and the 2000s as the pressures both of rapidly increasing workloads, of new expectations of the nature of research created by the research assessment exercises, and a change in the attitude of the university to its respective national, international, as opposed to local roles, meant that there were great pressures on colleagues to withdraw essentially from this activity in the region and to focus instead elsewhere. And to me, at least, it's been a welcome aspect of the new emphasis since 2010 or so on impact, on partnerships, and indeed on public history, that we have been picking up again that agenda of regional and local leadership. And I'm full of appreciation for the colleagues in the department and around the university who've been leading on re-establishing those kind of strong ties. And I think Joyce again would be very pleased that that has returned. So I want to focus a bit on the nature of local and regional history, and doing it particularly in an urban history context. But we need to think, what is the place of local and regional history? Now, Joyce's London training and also her inheritance in many ways of a tradition of English local history, which had actually been established by two other Devonians, one of them indeed an Exonian, W.G. Hoskins, and his colleague Finberg, and the Department of English Local History that they had established at Leicester. They had established a very strong notion of the role to be played by local and regional history, and one which I think Joyce adopted, and one which in many ways I feel I have myself also followed. That local history had to be rigorously academically sound and also address itself to the big historical questions. It would answer those questions by understanding local communities and regional networks in a highly rigorous and academic fashion. But the questions that it would be attempting to answer by doing so were the ones that were of national and international as well as local significance. And that at the heart of the methodology of doing this would be comparison, rigorous comparisons, setting up types and testing their effectiveness, and asking questions across a range of local communities. And the traditions established by this produced profound work both in agrarian history, notably the agrarian histories of England and Wales, but also in urban history. It's no coincidence that the Centre for Urban History emerged at Leicester out of local history. And if we look back at Joyce's own career and publications, we can see how her work reflected this vigorous and rigorous use of the local, in her case largely of Devon material, in order to address the big questions. She established this first in her work on the dissolution of the monasteries and their property, based on her case study of Devon for her PhD and the book and of local records that followed from that, but also turned into a volume exploring the same issue from a national perspective. Her work on Tucker's Hall as an example of a guild remains to this day the most rigorous and impressive study of any guild body in England that has been published, certainly outside London. Her work, as I say, on maritime history, leading to the new maritime history of Devon, studies of both Barnstaple and native town and Exeter, such as, for example, her own inaugural lecture given in 1974, which took the opportunity of local government reorganisation that year and Exeter's loss of its separate county status to look back at the moment in 1537 when Exeter obtained county status as a city and county separate from Devon, and engaged in a rigorous analysis both of the local factors that led that to happen, but also how that compared with and was part of a broader national trend that was occurring at that period under the well-known figure of Thomas Cromwell. So all of Joyce's work was always rigorously national and comparative, and led in many ways to perhaps her most important work, and one which is still very much worth reading, Penguin's Social History of Tudor England, published in 1984. And reading Joyce's introduction to that is very interesting because she begins immediately with the theme of unity and variety. She notices that, on the one hand, we could say that England in the 16th century was, by contemporary standards, a remarkably unified nation with common ways of life and institution compared to many other societies of the time. But at the same time, she notices that it was very much a patchwork of varied local communities, identities with different circumstances. And she's immediately established, in a sense, that the task of the historian is to hold those two features, the unifying and the diversifying. What is the common thing and what are the local aspects? To hold those in balance. And that is, in a sense, the task of the local and regional historian. And I want to suggest, in many ways, that I feel that my own career has been an attempt in its own way to actually follow through on that same agenda. Before exploring that a bit, I want to actually quote a few passages from Joyce's introduction. She says, "It is easier to discern the features common to such widespread phenomena as open field villages, isolated hill farms, market towns, and cathedral cities than to generalize about whole counties. Comparative studies have made some progress, notably in the case of towns, but there is still a need for more agreement about the questions which need to be asked and the form in which the answers can most usefully be presented. The danger is that local material will be drawn upon merely to illustrate what appears to be either typical or peculiar in the light of old generalizations, rather than to serve as the basis for new and more sensitive analyses." As I say, I feel that not only summarizes what Joyce was attempting to do in her career, but also what I've been attempting to do. And I want to talk about some of the issues associated with that in relation to my own work and into relation to how one might compare Exeter and Bristol to develop those points she makes there. It's interesting that at that point in her introduction, Joyce in fact leaves these methodological remarks and then immediately begins to discuss the nature of the sources for social history. And that again reflects another dimension of her career, and one that I want to develop, a rigorous focus on the nature and survival of sources. And she published distinguished work for both the Institute of Historical Research and the Historical Association on the nature and how we analyze such sources for this period. And of course, any kind of comparison that one is going to attempt between different places is going to be very much shaped by the nature of the sources available for them. Now, you might think that in dealing in, what as she said, in some ways is a very homogeneous society with similar institutional forms in its different places and similar traditions, that there would be a lot of similarity between the sources available to us to study Bristol and Exeter in this period. But what has actually struck me, particularly in fact, as in recent years I've had the pleasure of supervising a series of excellent PhDs on the history of Exeter, is how different the records are that those working on Exeter have to what I had when I was working on Bristol. There are a number of key differences, partly in what was created, but particularly, in fact, in what has survived to us to work on. One obvious difference that many people point out, and I'm not going to explore in depth here, though one could, is the difference in the survival of probate records, of wills and inventories, where famously the bombing of the Second World War led to the destruction of the vast bulk of Devon's, including Exeter's wills and inventories, although fortunately the Orphans Court inventories for Exeter survived and have recently been published. The disasters of the Second World War, on the other hand, whilst most of Bristol's records survived, the one set that were destroyed incomplete were those of Bristol's Corporation of the Poor, sitting in St. Peter's Hospital, which were destroyed in the Blitz in the castle area of Bristol, destroying all the records of the poor relief system, which was a civic one from 1697 onwards in Bristol. By contrast, the Corporation of the Poor, which Exeter set up on the same model a few years later in 1700, have fortunately survived, and incidentally, I think deserve a great deal more attention. Exeter undoubtedly has better court records, particularly for the period before the Civil War, than have survived for Bristol. And Exeter, of course, also has the inestimable advantage of having had as its chamberlain and essentially civic archivist for the second half of the 16th century, John Hooker, about whom Joyce has written most effectively. And Hooker's legacy, both of the records that he organised and survived, but also of the notes that he kept, giving us, in a sense, an inner perspective on Exeter and how it operated in this period, in many ways is unique, and nothing similar survives for Bristol. Bristol's equivalent perhaps actually lies back in the 15th century, both with the role of the town clerk, Rickard, and also William of Worcester's extraordinary topography of Bristol in 1480, which takes us round the city physically in a way that doesn't survive for Exeter. But perhaps the most significant difference between the two cities is the survival for Bristol from the early 16th century onwards of essentially a continuous set of freedom and apprenticeship registers in a way that does not exist for Exeter. Exeter's freedom information has been lovingly recreated by Rowe and Jackson, but as they admit in their volume, essentially they had to put together a series of sources of information to reconstruct those with gaps in it, because we don't have a set of Burgess books as such for much of the period. But even more notably, Exeter has no set of civic apprenticeship records. I'm not quite sure, in fact, whether this is because they never existed, were never kept, or whether they just have not survived. But for the kind of work that has been central to much of my research, which has been essentially prosopographical, putting together the careers of people in a series of different occupations, most recently in medical occupations, it's very significant that we cannot do the same work for Exeter that we can do for Bristol, because we cannot reconstruct the complete apprenticeship record for Exeter. We only know that minority of cases, almost certainly, where one person's apprentice then became free, and the information about their apprenticeship is recorded as part of the freedom data. We can't know all the other people who were apprenticed in Exeter then chose not to become free of the city, either because they did not then practice here or because they chose not to take out the freedom. And that will vary greatly from one occupation to another, one period to another. We have some guild records that provide apprenticeship information, but we can't compare that with a civic set in the way that we can for Bristol, so we cannot get a complete urban picture. And this means that actually trying to compare the two cities, for example, in the role that they played in training not just their own towns' occupations, but also those of the region around them and where the people were coming from to be trained by them, is a very different enterprise in these two towns. If one looked at the published work, one might also draw the conclusion that there's a difference between Bristol and Exeter in the survival of another set of records, namely that of tax records, because we have two splendid Devon and Cornwall Record Society volumes of taxation records for Tudor and 17th century Exeter, the latter edited by W.G. Hoskins, whereas until very recently we had no similar collection for Bristol, save that the 1524-5 subsidy information for Bristol was published as part of a study of Gloucestershire by the Gloucestershire Record Society. Is this really a difference in the survival of taxation records? I suspect actually not, and I'll come in a minute. I think it has more to do with publication. But there is one point at which the published records now coincide, and that is in relation to the hearth tax, established in 1662 and running till 1689. because at the heart of Hoskins' 17th century Exeter taxation records is the half tax return for 1671-2, on the basis of which he also wrote a very important comparative analysis. I have myself been involved in co-editing the Bristol half tax, which was published by the Bristol Record Society in 2018, and I analysed it for that. It has to be said that in this respect, at least, Bristol's records are superior to Exeter's, and indeed to essentially any other city, because for Bristol uniquely we have no less than 5 half tax listings between 1662 and 1673, which enables us to compare and correct the shortcomings of any individual set of half tax materials in a way not possible elsewhere. And I just like to indicate some of the interesting comparisons that actually emerge by comparing these two half tax returns, and also making an interesting point about comparison. So Hoskins compared, perhaps not surprisingly, Exeter with Leicester in his analysis. And because he found that the half tax information suggested greater social inequality in Exeter than in the considerably poorer and smaller town of Leicester, he ventured the conclusion from this that perhaps the half tax would so generally that the greater the wealth of a town, the greater the inequality. And he might also have looked across to Norwich for that at this time, second provincial town alongside perhaps with Bristol, which again shows great inequality in the half tax records. But actually, if we compare Exeter with Bristol, we find rather a different conclusion. It seems clear overall that Bristol was a wealthier city than Exeter, at least if we take the very crude, admittedly, measure of the mean half tax score as a sign of wealth. That mean for Bristol in the most comparable list, the one of 1670 to Exeter's 1671-2, that mean for Bristol is 3.07 halves, whereas for Exeter it is only 2.59. We also see that a far smaller proportion of Bristol's halves were the smallest 1 or 2 half properties, only 52% in Bristol compared to 70% in Exeter. We also see, if we look at the balance between 1 and 2 half properties, a very different result. In Bristol, there were only 711 one half and 1,167 2 half properties. In Exeter, the balance was the other way round, 1,073 one half properties and only 573 2 halves. We also see a greater variation, not just perhaps socially, but also topographically within the city. Slightly complicated this because in Exeter, by this stage, they're still recording the half tax by parish, whereas Bristol, which had both a parish and a ward system, was by this point recording its half tax in slightly larger wards. But if we compare the highest and the lowest unit, we find that the highest rated parish in Exeter had 2.7 times the average half score from the lowest rated parish, whereas the equivalent difference between the wards in Bristol is only 1.95. So the differentiation across the city topographically was less. And indeed, there were 7 Exeter parishes with averages between 1.8 and 2.4 that fell below the half mean average of any of Bristol's wards. So Exeter was both, by this definition, poorer and more unequal than Exeter, even though Bristol appears to have been larger. So that comparison suggests that Hoskins' tentative hypothesis based on his comparison with Leicester was actually wrong, at least in relation to these two cities. I want to make another point based on this taxation record comparison, and that gets back to my point about what is published, because in some ways it's slightly ironic that Exeter has a better publication of taxation records than Bristol, at least until recently, because in general terms, of course, Bristol has an advantage in terms of its record for publication to Exeter, namely that the Bristol Record Society, established back in the 1930s, has devoted itself since then, with over 70 publications, specifically to the history of that city, whereas Exeter's publications have always come as part of the much wider remit, obviously, of the Devon and Cornwall Record Society. And although that has published a series of very important and distinguished volumes on Exeter, and overall, of course, has had more publications, it means that there are far fewer publications devoted specifically to the records of Exeter that have been published than to those of Bristol. That, of course, partly says something about the status of the two cities in the 19th and 20th centuries, and Bristol's much greater size in the modern period. But it also, of course, in a sense, reflects a historical truth about the nature of these two cities in the early modern period, and about the degree to which they were autonomous, in a sense, from the counties around them. Bristol has never fitted into England's county system and has never been a county town in the way that Exeter was. Bristol, of course, sat on the boundary between Gloucestershire and Somerset, and indeed until 1373 fell into those two counties, with the River Avon running down the very middle of the city, representing the boundary between the two. Partly because of that and the jurisdictional and other complications that created, Bristol was made a county of itself in 1373, the first city county outside London in England. And as I say, Bristol was not part of a county structure. Similarly, until 1542, it was not a cathedral city and did not form part of a diocese. By contrast, Exeter, of course, has been for many centuries the county town of Devon and Devon's central place, and indeed in many ways the central place of the Southwest Peninsula because of its location. Now, one could make the point, and Joyce makes the point, that to be the central place of Devon is a very complex thing, because Devon was such a large and topographically distinct county with two coastlines, two sets of uplands, and so on, that no one place, in a sense, could really capture the whole of Devon's activity, but insofar as anywhere was well placed to do so, that was certainly Devon, certainly Exeter, and one could say the same about its location within the Southwest Peninsula, as very much the central point of that peninsula. And, of course, once its cathedral had been established in the 11th century, it also became the diocesan centre for Devon and Cornwall up until the Diocese of Truro was established in the 1870s. So Exeter, although it did become jurisdictionally a county of itself in 1537, remained very much a county and diocesan and provincial capital in a very different way from Bristol. Bristol did gain cathedral status in 1542 when its abbey was turned into a cathedral. But that abbey sat on the outskirts of Bristol town, like Exeter Cathedral, obviously sitting right absolutely in the middle of it. That abbey and that cathedral was both extremely poorly endowed as a diocese, and also, of course, was a very strange diocese which combined the deanery of the hinterland of Bristol with the county of Dorset, such that Bristol never formed, as it were, a natural diocesan capital. It was always squeezed essentially between Gloucester to the north and Bath and Wells to the south. So Bristol never played the part in county and diocesan government that Exeter was to play. And I think it's fair to say that the status and control and role of the church as a rival, in a sense, to city authority was also and lay authority was never the same in Bristol as it potentially was in Exeter. And those are obviously crucial factors in their histories. Despite this, there are very good reasons for wanting to compare Exeter and Bristol, particularly in the period between 1500 and 1700, which is the period when the history of the two towns, in fact, comes closest together, and the similarities, as opposed to the differences which I've been stressing up to now, perhaps become most obvious. If we look back to their origins in the medieval period, one would probably stress difference. Obviously, Exeter was a Roman city contained for many centuries within Roman walls, as well as the establishment of the cathedral and its close. Bristol did not emerge as a town of any significance until the 11th century, and as we see, was not a cathedral city until the 16th century. Both had castles, but it has to be said that in the medieval period, Bristol's castle, and indeed Bristol's role in the defence and the political life of England, was a great deal greater than that of Exeter, particularly because of the pivotal role it played in relation to Wales and especially Ireland in English and British affairs during this period. But Bristol rapidly grew to be England's second city, its major provincial city during the medieval period, rivaled perhaps only by York, at a time when Exeter was essentially as a town, as opposed to a cathedral, languishing as a very small settlement, really, within its Roman walls, such that, as Hoskins points out, in the later 14th century, Exeter, certainly as measured by population and taxable wealth, didn't fall even within the top 20 towns of England, whereas Bristol ranked second. But a great deal changed in the late medieval period and the early 16th century, when Exeter underwent its extraordinary first boom associated with the cloth industry of its hinterland, which incidentally was as much South Somerset in many ways as it was Devon, and also linking up with tin from both Devon and Cornwall. Exeter grew massively in wealth and in size in this period, such that by the time we get to the 1524-5 measure, we find that Exeter has joined Bristol as one of the 5 major provincial towns of England and is almost as big. Bristol may have had a population of 8,000 to 10,000. Exeter's probably of 7,000 to 8,000, so highly comparable. Bristol had basically languished in the late medieval period through a series of blows to its established trading networks. Exeter and Bristol both then underwent considerable doldrums in the early 16th century, partly for problems of their own and partly because, like all other provincial towns of this period, much of their trade and wealth was actually being stripped away by London, as London started its enormous growth in population and trading focus. And really, from the period from then up until the Civil War, we see only gradual growth in both Exeter and Bristol, Bristol keeping slightly ahead in terms of size, and for most years probably in trading, although occasionally, for example in 1619-20, Exeter actually traded more than Bristol did as a port. But they grew gradually up until the Civil War period, when Exeter probably had a population of about 12,000 and Bristol of about 16,000. They then underwent a very, again, comparable experience during the Civil War period, comparable, for example, in the fact that they both underwent successive sieges, first from the royalist forces to take them for the crown, and then from the parliamentary forces to take them back for Parliament. And they both suffered very considerably, both directly from this and indirectly from the spread of plague caused by these problems. And Exeter in particular also underwent very significant property destruction, as Mark Stoyle has demonstrated, such that the two towns probably did not recover their population until sometime in the 1660s or 1670s. Then, however, both towns entered a period of massive expansion in the late 17th and early 18th centuries as they both underwent trade booms. Bristol's based largely on the new development of its Atlantic trade, Exeter's based on a boom in its cloth industry trade, particularly to the Netherlands, such that by 1700, no less than 25% of England's cloth exports were actually going out through Exeter as a port. So this was a period of great growth and expansion for both cities, and population-wise, probably by 1700, Bristol had a population of maybe 22,000. Exeter's probably somewhere in the region of 15,000. The 18th century, however, was to see a huge divergence of fortunes. Essentially, Bristol turned out to a backed winner with the Atlantic trade, including, of course, sadly, the slave trade. And Exeter turned out to have backed, if not a loser, then certainly something that could not generate growth and in the long run was to decline, the European trade and the cloth trade of its hinterland, which gradually began to fall away. As a consequence, whereas Bristol doubled in size in the first half of the 18th century, Exeter probably grew very slowly. And by 1801, Bristol was no less than 3 times as large as Exeter, which still only had a population of just over 20,000. What Bristol had at the beginning of the 18th century, Bristol was now well over 60,000. So there's a huge divergence in their experience in the 18th century. But if we look back to the 16th and 17th centuries, we should expect to find things working out in many ways in very similar ways, because the two towns in many senses are being faced by similar issues, both in terms of population and economic change. In what follows, I want to focus on only a couple of aspects. Obviously, one thing one has to do in choosing comparisons, in a sense, is to choose certain themes to follow. And lying at the center of my own work has been to try and understand how, particularly Bristol, but also other civic communities responded to a series of challenges being posed to them throughout the early modern period. And I've already discussed, in a sense, implicitly one of those challenges, which is the challenge of population growth and the expansion physically and socially of these cities beyond their traditional medieval walls and jurisdictional systems, and how did they cope in responding to that. But also, particularly, how did that interact with and be affected by the other major change, which is the emergence of religious and political diversity within these cities. The initial impact of the Reformation, and then in particular the impact of the divisions which led up to and were of course greatly strengthened by the Civil War and the emergence of Protestant nonconformity, as well as by the late 17th century extra diversity being introduced by other religious groups emerging. Neither Bristol nor Exeter was much affected by Huguenot or other Protestant refugees from Europe until the late 17th centuries, and also this was when their Jewish communities began to establish themselves again, and also gradually we begin to see the re-emergence, mainly in the later 18th century, of Roman Catholic communities, but so it's primarily a question about Protestant nonconformity. And much of my work has been concerned with the impact of those religious and political diversities, and particularly the way in which they led into the emergence of late 17th century as a way, if you like, of party politics or ongoing political struggle, much of which was religious in character because it's centered on the question of the identity, both of the individual and of the community and of the nation in relation to religion. And one reason why that is so is because the structures of government, above all the parish, but also in many ways the city, and the relationship between parish and city, were so embedded by the 17th century in the notion of a single uniform nation, city, group with a common religion as well as other common forms of identity, that the struggle with the problems of that not existing was, if you like, I think the central question that was shaping the communities of this period. Even if, as we shall see, the answers in a sense to that question are going to be completely diverse in a whole range of local communities reflecting different circumstances and to some extent, as we shall see, different historical pathways and legacies. And of course, Exeter and Bristol are going to begin in very different places in a sense of doing that, because what we've already seen about their different character and legacy as towns in relation to county and particularly diocesan government, the different status of the cathedral and the church in Exeter compared to Bristol. But we can see many comparisons, many similarities. One that I already mentioned in passing when I was talking about record survival was the fact that both communities responded both to their late 17th century growth in size and to the question mark raised over the parish as a unit of local government by religious diversity and the existence of large numbers of people for whom the parish was no longer, in a sense, a natural focus of loyalty. Both of them responded at the end of the 17th century by the creation of corporations of the poor, taking the poor relief system out of parochial hands and putting it into civic hands. And it's very clear from the work I've done on the founder of John Carey, the founder of the Bristol Workhouse, and the background to that, that was not just an economic and sort of administrative issue, it was also a profoundly religious and political issue. And it was associated with an attempt, as it were, to establish a new Whig civic identity that was not based on the parish. Although it's an interesting feature that a few decades later, in fact, the Tories managed to capture control of Bristol's Corporation of the Poor, which actually became in many ways a focus of Tory strength after that, as opposed to a strongly Whig city corporation. So these things don't always last as their founders hoped they would. As I say, it would be fascinating to study the origins and development of Exeter's Corporation of the Poor to see to what extent the same was true in an Exeter where very strong Presbyterian traditions in government in the later in the city in the later 17th century had struggled to be reflected in civic or parish organisation. But I'm going to choose a slightly different case study to look at here, a case study wherein comparing the two cities, we can see how, as I say, a common set of challenges result in a very different set of outcomes depending on the two cities. Such that I think if you studied this phenomenon for just one of the cities without actually understanding the other, you might not recognize what are actually perhaps the most significant drivers taking place, something that becomes clear through comparison. And this is a study which is based on an article which I published in Urban History in 2019, so I apologize that this is not new research. This is a study of burial practices in Bristol and Exeter between the Reformation and the mid-19th century. I'm going to focus largely on the earlier period. I'll talk a little bit about the 18th century and onwards. By burial practices, incidentally, I don't mean, as it were, the details of ceremonies. I mean essentially where people were buried, in the sense of what were the burial grounds and what were the backgrounds and conditions underlying that. And of course, this is a phenomenon that is deeply shaped by the two sets of issues that I've highlighted so far: the issue of population growth and the changing topography of the cities on the one hand, and the issue of religious and political diversity, which has obviously in many ways shaped burial practices. And both cities, of course, are deeply affected by the Reformation, and particularly the removal with the Reformation of monasteries and priories as alternative possible sets of burials. They're also both deeply influenced by the impact of the Civil War and the emergence of religious diversity, although it's an important point to make both about these two cities and more generally that Protestant nonconformity did not translate itself immediately into a withdrawal from being buried in Anglican burial places. The only group for whom that is clearly true are the Quakers, who from their first establishment in the 1650s opt out of parish burials, because of course they have not only radical differences with the parishes, but radically different ideas about ritual. Other groups took longer. We see in these two cities the broad pattern that I think we see more generally. The next group to opt out are the Baptists, at some point, maybe a decade or two after their establishment. It takes a lot longer for Congregationalists and Presbyterians to decide to withdraw from Anglican burial practices, partly reflecting the fact that it takes them a long time to accept, in a sense, that they are no longer part of the national church and to break their ties completely with their local parish churches. Many of them continue to serve them, not least because until poor relief arrangements were taken out of the hands of parishes, there was a very good reason for these nonconformists to engage, in fact, in parish life in order to maintain those secular aspects of parish life. But also because it wasn't really until the early 18th century that the carrying out of a burial practice within an Anglican place was actually objectionable to Congregationalists or Presbyterians. It came when, as I say, they no longer saw themselves as belonging to the Church of England in any or its parishes in any sense, but also as they gradually began to drift doctrinally away from the Church of England, either towards a more extreme form of evangelical Calvinism in some cases, or perhaps even more significantly, towards Unitarianism in the shape of Presbyterians. If we take Exeter, for example, it's the emergence through the Exeter Assembly debates of the 1710s of a Unitarian form of worship in George's meeting that leads to the establishment by the 1740s of a dissenters' graveyard. But as I say, that is a slow process. And in these two towns, as well, as I say, it's quite late for Huguenots, Jews, and others to come along and add to that diversity. But if those are common features, then, as I say, we also see profound differences, and they reflect, in a sense, that medieval legacy of difference between the two cities. So one of the key features about Exeter, along with various other Western minster towns, is that in the Middle Ages, Exeter's cathedral maintained a monopoly of burials within the city walls, even as the parish structure gradually emerged in Exeter. So, as Nicholas Orme has famously demonstrated, as it were, Exeter Christians, unless they could find a monastic or priory thing, who were born with and lived within Exeter city walls, expected to be and would be buried in Exeter Cathedral Close, up as we shall see until 1637. By contrast, Bristol, as we say, didn't have a cathedral. The abbey was on the outskirts, and although the College Green, as it became known, the abbey's area in front of it, was used for burials by those associated with the abbey in the Middle Ages. When the Reformation came along, that burial practice in fact stopped on the College Green. The cathedral started burying its people in its cloisters, but it played no role in civic burial arrangements, which instead in Bristol, unlike Exeter, were organised by parishes. So the average Exeter parish had no churchyard. People were buried within the church itself, or they were buried in the cathedral close. Bristol, by contrast, each of its churches, its 17 parish churches, had smaller or slightly larger churchyards around them. So as Exeter grew, a question immediately posed: was the cathedral close capable of continuing to be Exeter's common graveyard? And this posed a paradox both to the cathedral authorities and to the city. As Exeter grew in size, in particular with the problems created by successive epidemics of plague, then suddenly you went from having to do a small number of burials to suddenly facing a large number of burials of bodies, of course, that were regarded as highly dangerous at a particular moment. There is also, of course, the cumulative effect over the centuries of gradually burying more and more bodies in a given area. And this became very visible topographically in Exeter by the early 17th century, where from various complaints and reports we have, and also indeed the archaeological evidence, you can see that the cathedral close was gradually growing higher up the sides of the walls of the cathedral and threatening to overwhelm both the cathedral and also the other buildings of the cathedral close around it, which were of course largely occupied by the cathedral officials and workers. So, did the cathedral wish to maintain its monopoly? But what would happen if it gave it up? Would it not be giving up its claim, in a sense, one of its central claims, to be at the heart of the identity of the city? We need to remember here, of course, that there were many conflicts going on between the city and cathedral authorities in Exeter because of the strong jurisdictional claims to independence of the cathedral. Claims that have been slightly dented, and it was probably one of the reasons for it, by the county status granted to the city in 1537, but there were other battles that the cathedral won. And particularly in the early 17th century, whereas Mark Stoll has shown the Puritan authorities of the city were at considerable loggerheads with the cathedral authorities. It must have been, on the one hand, a considerable problem to the city that its citizens, as it were going to have to be buried within the cathedral close under the aegis of the cathedral. But on the other hand, this was a symbol, again, as I say, of civic identity and in some ways of the ownership of the city over that cathedral close. How could that be resolved, and how could the practical problems being created by the growth there? And as I show in this article, it appears that in the late 1620s, early 1630s, although we don't really understand the details of this, that a compromise was gradually worked out, despite ongoing conflicts of jurisdiction and so on between the two, perhaps helped by the somewhat ironical figure of Bishop Hall as the Bishop of Exeter at this time, in which in 1637 the city and the cathedral joined in partnership to close the cathedral close to normal burials and to establish a new civic burial yard in Bartholomew's. And I think, incidentally, part of the clue to the compromise may lie in that name, a name given to the new burial ground because it was opened on St. Bartholomew's Day, the 24th of August, 1637. And of course, St. Bartholomew's Day was the anniversary of the terrible massacre of Huguenots in Paris, and therefore it was, as it were, a symbol of anti-Catholic thing. And I think that may have been a significant kind of linking point where the Puritans and least moderate Anglicans, if we want to use those problematic language, could come together. After the Civil War, incidentally, they then established a second joint burial ground of civic and cathedral partnership in the 1660s in Southernhay, although by this stage this reflected perhaps that the newly established restored civic authorities after 1660 were very much Anglican, Tory Anglican, if we want to again use a slightly anachronistic term. And this was a new alliance of the city and the cathedral after the traumatic events of the 1640s and 50s, including, of course, the dividing of the cathedral in half to form two Congregational and Presbyterian congregations that had happened in the 1650s. But the important point is that Exeter, therefore, because of its legacy, chose to adopt a civic burial ground solution, and one that lasted, because of Exeter's modest population growth, for a very long time. So it was not, in fact, until the 1830s and the threat of cholera that these two new civic burial grounds, the larger one in Bartholomew's and the smaller one in Southernhay, were to be replaced. Admittedly, Exeter was also helped by the fact that much of the population growth that was taking place in the extramural parishes, St Sidwell's, St David's and St Thomas over the river, which had never been part of the city cathedral monopoly, had always had their own churchyards and were able to grow gradually, and an ever-increasing proportion of Exonians were also buried there. So we see a civic solution in many ways, and one which perhaps because of the particular conditions of Exeter was able not only to be established, even in difficult circumstances in the 1630s, but to thrive and last as a partnership after the Civil War and be, in a sense, fit for Exeter's needs until the early 19th century. In Bristol, we see a totally different situation. As I say, it was the parishes that had traditionally managed burials in Bristol, and of course, with the decline of monastic and priory alternatives, including the disappearance of the abbey, in many ways that reliance on the parishes strengthened. There was no civic tradition of dealing with burials as an issue, and one of the significant facts is that in the ongoing disputes on a much lesser scale between Bristol City and Cathedral, and more generally in terms of Bristol's civic policy, we can call it that, I see no signs of the city essentially attempting to address the question of burials, let alone address it in partnership with the cathedral. Instead, effectively, the individual parishes of Bristol were left dealt with the problem of ever-increasing number of burials and the challenge of epidemic burials and so on. And they did that essentially in a highly piecemeal fashion, essentially on the one hand by trying to gain small extra areas of space around their burial grounds, or even little extra adjacent spaces that they could use for burials, but also by essentially piling more and more bodies, pitchforking them, one might say, almost literally, as it were, into their burial spaces, which by the population growth of the 18th century was becoming a real challenge. And the other consequence of that was that it seems that more and more Bristol burials were actually brought into, and in particular under, their church structures, that they went in for vaults and crypts to a very considerable extent, changing because the fabric, in a sense, of the churches to cope with this problem, and probably a sort of social effect going on here, which is that as having your relatives' bodies buried out in the main burial ground became increasingly unpleasant and unlikely for the bodies to remain undisturbed for very long, it probably became an increasing social cachet to have the body buried more safely within or underneath the church. But Bristol was also not only to be affected by much, particularly in the 18th century, by much greater population pressure, but also in Bristol, the question of relying upon the parishes as a basis for burial was to become very problematic with the spread of nonconformity. Both because the nonconformist groups were, at least by the 18th century, much stronger in Bristol than they were in Exeter. And because, as I say, the fact that burial was being addressed at a parish level and not a civic level probably meant that the issues raised by that became much stronger in Bristol. In Exeter, after all, from the time of Bartholomew onwards, as an Exeter citizen, you could perhaps feel that you were being buried in your city's burial ground, even if you no longer felt an identity with the Church of England, even though they were officially Church of England burial grounds. But in Bristol, the choice was it a parish burial ground, or did you establish your own in a much more direct way? Nevertheless, it is only gradually that we see in Bristol the burial grounds emerging along the kind of chronology that I described, although on a larger scale than for Exeter. So it is first the Quakers who immediately, as I say, move outside those burial grounds and establish their own burial grounds, two of them associated with the two meeting houses in different parts of the city. The next group to come to do so around the 1670s are the Baptists, who establish burial grounds for their chapels. And it is not until the early 18th century that the various Presbyterian and congregational bodies in Bristol begin to establish their own burial places. But when they do so, as I say, on a larger scale than in Exeter, and also probably having a much greater impact in terms of the numbers buried there. So even in the end of the 18th century, as Ransom Pickard's work has shown, only about 3% of Exeter's population are buried in a non-Anglican graveyard, whereas in Bristol, the figure was probably more than 10%. We also find in the late 18th century that another tradition emerges in Bristol, which is the establishment of private, commercially based burial grounds, which seem to have competed both on price, as the cost of being buried in the other places rose, particularly if you wanted to be inside the churches or underneath them, but also probably competed to some extent on ecumenical grounds, that again, they were essentially non-denominational places to be buried. And we see the emergence of a series of these in the late 18th century. But essentially, Bristol never adopts a civic solution to its burial problems until it is forced to do so, again by the same circumstances that forced Exeter to do so, namely the cholera outbreaks of the 1830s, when gradually, admittedly again also partly by private initiative, a cemetery-based solution emerges, as is also to emerge in Exeter in the Victorian period. So I hope this case study has been of interest as an example of how one can, in a sense, pose the same problems for two cities, but see them being solved in very different ways, reflecting, if you like, a different balance of forces, of opportunities, of possibilities, and also different historic pathways and choices made and not made in these different towns, and how they create very different outcomes. And as I say, I think if I had studied either of these by themselves without being aware of the contrast with the other, it would not have got me to ask the same questions or necessarily offer the same causal explanations of change that one gets by making this kind of comparison. And of course, the implication of this may be that by making comparisons with other towns, one would actually, again, uncover different patterns. So I hope this has illustrated both the role but also the challenges faced by approaching local and regional history in the rigorous way that Joyce and the tradition that she belonged to reflects, and how this enables local and regional examples to address the questions that were posed by what I think is this balance that Joyce was trying to strike, and I have always tried to strike, between understanding England at this period as, on the one hand, strongly united in the sense that the same problems and challenges and issues were arising everywhere, and in a sense the same common set of possibilities and aspects are at play everywhere. But on the other hand, each individual community both has a unique combination, in a sense, of those factors, and also can adopt different solutions depending on a range of possibilities and balances. And in fact, in many other areas, it's even more complicated, because these, as my Corporation of the Poor example, are often solutions that work a certain way for a certain period of time, and then actually, as factors change, can then change their meaning and take on different significances. This is, I think, the contribution that the local and regional historian can make to broader patterns. But the final point I want to make is that I think this nowadays also is not just a question of the relationship of the local to the national, but also of the local to the global. And I was very impressed and interested to listen to Jane Whittle's lecture given last week to our early modern postgraduate seminar jointly with Bristol, where Jane brought out, as it were, the connections between the local and the global. Of course, Joyce's maritime work in many ways was associated with that as well, and her work on Sir Walter Raleigh, another distinguished aspect of her career that I hadn't really touched on now. So Joyce was very conscious, in a sense, that actually the local was also the global. And as my colleagues, as I say, pick up once again, in a way that I'm extremely proud of, the task, in a sense, of leading local and regional history in this region, I know that they will do so now with a very strong sense that this is not just, as I say, a national issue, English social history, but is perhaps an issue central to our times, in a sense of how we link the local and the global, and live in a way, in a sense, that reflects the challenges facing both. Thank you very much for listening.